what is it that we're doing here? Okay, before I get into any philosophy and anything else, couple points of order. One, this is a kind of 2-hour lecture. I don't know if we'll use all the time. If we do, great. If we don't, people can go home and it's fine, right? There will be a 15-minute break partway through, so people can, you know, go use the toilet and stretch their legs and do whatever, right? The other thing is, this lecture is going to be a little bit more informal than usual because I have to cover a lot of ground. Right? This is all the preparatory stuff, so that we can get into more specifics and details in the next few weeks. And that normally I kind of have a PowerPoint presentation, but I have perhaps disastrously decided to work from notes. We'll see how this goes. Okay, one other thing. I know some people are uncomfortable asking questions and kind of announcing their presence or even just raising their hand, right? So could everybody who is uncomfortable raising their hand please raise their hand? So that's a terrible philosophy joke, right? Awful. Philosophers love paradoxes. But there is a serious point, which is that in order for this to go well, I need to get some kind of feedback from you. Right? Even when you might not want to answer questions, or you might not want to proffer your own opinion, I might need to say, look, whoever thinks this, put their hands up. Whoever doesn't, keep their hands down. Right? It's the simplest way of getting some kind of feedback. And I need that to make sure that I haven't lost the room when I'm teaching. Hopefully we'll develop better ways to kind of communicate as we go.
Sorry, babe, I'm just interrupting you. I'm going to drag some tables over
Yeah.
Squeeze past you.
So,
This isn't ideal.
yeah, well, nothing is ideal, and this is one of the topics we will be covering in this course. So, right. So, what I'd like to actually start with is what I consider to be a very good joke, right? There are a lot of jokes about the Holy Trinity from Christianity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I think this is probably the finest one that's ever been written. And if you don't laugh at it, what I'd like to do is to have you, by the end of the course, see how funny I think this is. So, right.
Gentlemen, thank you all for coming. I know you have parishes, flocks, and temples making enormous demands on your time, but I'm sure you appreciate also that great masses of humanity look to pictures for information and uplift and, yes, entertainment. Here at Capitol Pictures, as you know, an army of technicians and actors and top-notch artistic people are working hard to bring to the screen the story of the Christ. It's a swell story. A story told before, yes, but we like to flatter ourselves that it's never been told with this kind of distinction and panache.
Perhaps, sir, you forget its telling in the Holy Bible.
Quite right, Patriarch. The Bible, of course, is terrific, but for millions of people, pictures will be their reference point for the story. The story's embodiment. The story's,
Realization.
realization.
You realize, of course, that for we Jews, any visual depiction of the Godhead is most strictly prohibited.
Oh.
But of course, for us, the man Jesus Nazarene is not God.
Aha!
Who plays Christ?
A kid we're all very excited about. Todd Hawkeiser. Wonderful young actor we found in Akron, Ohio in a nationwide talent hunt. But Hawkeiser is seen only fleetingly and with extreme taste. Our story is told through the eyes of a Roman tribune, Autolycus Antoninus. Ordinary man, skeptical at first, but who comes to a grudging respect for this swell figure from the East. And Autolycus is played by Baird Whitlock.
Oh, my. Well, he is certainly a great talent.
Now, Hail Caesar is a prestige picture, our biggest release of the year, and we're devoting huge resources to its production in order to make it first class in every respect. Gentlemen, given its enormous expense, we don't want to send it to market except in the certainty that it will not offend any reasonable American regardless of faith or creed. Now, that's where you come in. You've read the script. I want to know if the theological elements of the story are up to snuff.
I thought the chariot scene was fakey. How is he going to jump from one chariot to the other going full speed?
Well, we can look at that. But as for the religious aspect, does the depiction of Christ Jesus cut the mustard?
Well, the nature of Christ is not quite as simple as your photoplay would have it.
How so, Father?
It's not the case simply that Christ is God or God Christ.
You could say that again. The Nazarene was not God.
He was not God.
He was a man.
Part God.
No, sir.
Rabbi, all of us have a little bit of God in us, don't we?
Well, it's the foundation of our belief that Christ is most properly referred to as the Son of God. It's the Son of God who takes the sins of the world upon himself, so that the rest of God's children, we imperfect beings, through faith, may enter the kingdom of heaven.
So God is split?
Yes and no.
There is unity in division.
And division in unity.
I'm not sure I follow, Padre.
Young man, you don't follow for a very simple reason. These men are screwballs. God has children? What, and a dog? A collie, maybe? God doesn't have children. He's a bachelor, and very angry.
No, he used to be angry.
What, he got over it?
You worship the God of another age.
Who has no love.
Not true. He likes Jews.
God loves everyone.
God is love.
God is who is.
This is special? Who isn't who is?
But how should God be rendered in a motion picture?
God isn't in the motion picture.
Then who is Todd Harkage?
Gentlemen, maybe we're biting off more than we can chew. We don't need to agree on the nature of the deity here. If we could focus on the Christ, whatever his parentage. My question is our depiction fair?
I have seen worse.
Reverend?
There's nothing to offend a reasonable man.
Father?
Well, the motion picture teleplay was respectful and exhibited tastefulness and class.
Who made you an expert all of a sudden?
And what do you think, Rabbi?
I haven't an opinion.
How'd we do?
I don't. Fine. What's up?
Right? And that's the entire history of the debate over the Holy Trinity in the Christian Church, right? In one joke, which I can't play. This is something that, like, literally wars were fought over. Like, over this question of the sense in which Jesus is or isn't God and how to tweak it, how to, like, say, well, yeah, no, maybe get a little bit more precise. That whole theological debate, it cost lives. People were tortured over it, right? But with the benefit of hindsight and, you know, at least 1,000 years, we can kind of laugh at it. Okay. So, let's actually start. I'll turn this on. So, what are we doing here? This course is called Philosophy and Religion, right? And what I want to kind of do is to maybe sort of break that question down a bit. So the first thing we might ask is, what is religion, right? I don't know, right? Don't know. I'm hoping that over the course of the term that we can maybe try to come up with a better answer to this question, that I can understand the topic better through trying to talk to you about particular religion and particular issues, right? The one thing I know is that whenever we talk about religion, one concept comes up, and it's the concept of the divine, right? And we use this concept because we don't just want to say God, because there is polytheism in which there are multiple gods, right? And there are sort of interesting intermediate positions, like in Hinduism, right, where there is in some sense multiplicity and unity, right? And there are other religions with stranger conceptions of whatever is playing the role of God or gods in their worldview, right? So we use the concept of the divine to kind of wrap those all together. Another point of order, it would be really great if we had time to deal with a whole bunch of different religions, particularly non-Western and non-Abrahamic ones, but we don't. We're mainly going to be focusing on Christianity with a little bit of the other Abrahamic religions, Islam, and Judaism thrown in. Right? If you, in seminars and in your essays, want to talk about other religions, fine. I'm overjoyed. Right? That would be absolutely fantastic. But it will be important for you to talk about the actual topics that we're covering. Right? You can't just say, I just want to talk about Buddhism. You're going to have to say some things about Christian theology. There's no way around it. Right? So, okay, so that's religion. We're not sure what it is, but it's got something to do with this concept of the divine. What is philosophy? This is quite important. You guys have, not everybody's doing a straight philosophy degree, but some of you are, right? And it's probably sort of important to you to understand what it is you're doing and why you're here. The problem is, if you ask any two philosophers, they will give you a completely different answer. Ask two people in a department what they think philosophy is. In this department, no two people will give you the same answer. Right? Okay. How do we deal with that? Well, I'm going to pick two philosophers and give you their answers and then give you mine. So, right. Let's start with the golden oldie, Socrates, who we'll talk a little bit more about. Right? Socrates Socrates builds around the word philosophy, right? Because the word philosophy means the love of wisdom. And Socrates opposes himself to the sophists, who are people who claim they have wisdom. It's Sophia, the Greek word. Right? Socrates refuses to say he is wise, only that he loves wisdom. Right? And the most famous way he expresses this idea, it's kind of apocryphal, but it's easier to say it this way, is that all that I know is that I know nothing. Socrates refuses to claim he knows anything. He will just walk into a situation and ask a question. Right? So, got this down as. So, yes, right. Love of wisdom. Right? Wisdom. And that is, in a certain sense, knowing nothing. Then there's a much more recent philosopher called Wilfrid Sellars. I'm a big fan of. And he wrote this fantastic essay called Philosophy and the Scientific Environment. And in it, he said that philosophy is the attempt to see how everything, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hangs together in the broadest possible sense of the term. How does every bit of human knowledge hang together? Right? The philosopher has to think about everything and range across every discipline. Right? In this sense, philosophy is not a discipline amongst others. It's the philosopher, like Socrates, gets to walk everywhere and into any room and ask questions. Right? So let's call this synopsis. Right? Philosopher is about synopsis, synoptic knowledge. But the other way of putting this might be to say it's about, in some sense, knowing everything. Right? But those two things seem to be quite contradictory. How do we think of philosophy as being both about knowing nothing and about knowing everything? Like, right, how does that work? Here's me. Right? Oh. Pete. Right? And you don't have to agree with this. You can completely disagree with this, but I think it's useful. I think that philosophy is the art of asking questions. Right? This is the common thread between these things is the philosopher gets to walk anywhere and ask questions. Right? What philosophy can't necessarily provide you with is answers. A lot of people think this. A lot of people think, well, philosophy, it never actually gets anywhere, right? That's the wrong way of looking at this, right? But I'm going to try and show you what I mean. So, if we thought of philosophy as a discipline, as a discipline with its own specific set of questions to answer, right? What kind of questions would we pick? Right? Anyone?
What's the meaning of life?
That's exactly the one I was looking for. Thank you. Like, what's the meaning of life? Right? And this is the only philosophical question that a lot of people know, right? Like, if you're a philosopher, you study philosophy, and you go to a family party, you know, what's the meaning of philosophy? What's the meaning of life, right? You go to a family party, you will have people come up to you and say, well, like, what's all this about then? And you'll give some kind of explanation, and then inevitably they will say, well, let me tell you my philosophy, right? And what they mean is something like, let me tell you what I think the meaning of life is. Let me tell you what I think the important things are, right? Okay, that does seem to be maybe a peculiarly philosophical question, precisely because nothing is outside of it, right? Everything is relevant to it. When we say life, we mean the whole shebang, right? What sort of questions aren't philosophical? What is an example of a definitely not philosophical question? Anyone?
Is it right to hold Platonism from our practice?
Nice. I have a feeling that that's something contrary to the meaning of life, but I'll have to spell it out. Like, yeah. Anything else? Come on. No?
What's 2 plus 2?
Excellent. Right, what's 2 plus 2? Right. Question in mathematics. Right? That seems to be not a question that philosophers should have anything to do with. Right? We might come up with a bunch of others. So let's say like mathematics. These are other disciplines like mathematics, physics, politics, and let's throw in art as well, right? And we can think of examples of questions from these fields. Like anybody, so we've got what is 2 plus 2. Right? I might throw in, is there a largest prime number? It's a classical mathematical question. Is there a biggest prime number? Right? There isn't, we can prove it. But it was a question that needed to be answered at one point. It's less obvious than 2 plus 2 equals 4. Right? Question from physics, anyone?
Diameter of the Earth.
Say that again, sorry?
The diameter of the Earth.
Diameter of the Earth? Yeah, I'll take that. Like, diameter of the Earth. Of Earth. And I'll throw another one in. So I'm just taking prime numbers there. And I'll say, is there a smallest particle? Right? We keep knocking matter down to smaller and smaller things. How small can we get? Right? That seems like a really important question for physics, right? Politics. Right? Political questions. Anyone? Politics is pretty strange right now in the UK, so there's a lot of questions coming out of it.
Is taxation theft?
Yes, right. Taxation, right? Is taxation theft? Theft? Question mark, right? Let me throw another one in. Like, is there a best form of government? Right, that's a pretty important question, right? That seems to start getting closer to questions about the meaning of life, because it seems like this is a condition of doing whatever this is well, right? Okay, art. I overheard someone talking about Tarantino films when coming in. Question about Tarantino films.
Is Pulp Fiction a good film?
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to say, like, is Pulp Fiction Tarantino's best film? I mean, that's a question that we could get into. Like, I would quite happily just stop what I'm doing and talk about Tarantino films and which one's best if I got the chance, but I have to somehow teach you about philosophy and religion. Okay, so you've got all these questions, right, that seem to be not part of philosophy, right? But if I went into mathematics and I asked, well, what is a prime number? In fact, you know what, better, what's a number? Right? What are mathematical objects? And how do we know that they have any properties? Right? Back in philosophy, right? Physics. Is there a smallest particle? Right? What is a particle? Does it even make sense to ask that question? Some physicists will say no. Like, when we get down to fundamentals, the very idea of particle just stops making any sense. Right? Politics, taxation, is it theft? What's taxation? Right? What even is taxation? Right? What are taxes? Like, this is an important question in political philosophy. And basically, what is the best form of government is just like the ultimate question in political philosophy, right? And art, well, is Pulp Fiction Tarantino's best film? Well, one thing you might want to ask is, what is cinema? What is the medium of cinema? What does it do? Like, how do we understand cinema as opposed to literature, as opposed to music, as opposed to theatre and drama, right? Then we are back in philosophy. Right? The questions are still there, right? There's still room for philosophers to work. And indeed, philosophers aren't just people who are trained in philosophy, right? Film directors will ask and answer philosophical questions, and they'll do it with more panache, usually, than most philosophers, right? And if you love wisdom, you shouldn't walk into the field of cinema and say, well, I know everything about cinema, all right? I'm going to tell you which is the best film, all right? You should go in and maybe ask some tentative questions. Right? Like, well, okay, I respect your opinion, but do we know what cinema is? That's the kind of thing that philosophers do. And this does actually break down into specific subfields of philosophy. Right, so, and the reason for, well, let me rewind one last point, right? If we were to look at this, I've been giving you this kind of fairly abstractly, but if we were to look at this historically, at least in the Western intellectual tradition, what we'd see is that basically every other discipline emerges out of philosophy, maybe with the exception of medicine and business schools, right? This is why when you get a PhD in any subject, right, you're getting a doctorate of philosophy in engineering, chemistry, whatever, right? So when Isaac Newton asked the question, what is force, right, and changed physics completely, right, he thought he was asking a question in natural philosophy, right? That his answer then ended up defining what physics is, right, historically. And this is how things have developed, right? Disciplines get defined by their capacities to answer questions, right? By the actual concrete forms of wisdom and knowledge they encode, but there's always this lingering legacy of philosophy inside them, right? So, in a certain sense, what philosophy is what's left behind by the history of the growth of human knowledge, the questions that you can't delegate to any specific field, we're left with them. Right? So what kind of questions are these? Philosophy is kind of split in two, and again, everything I'm saying here is controversial and other people will completely disagree with, right? And you can disagree with it. But what I want to give you is a kind of map of the field in order to think about what we're doing. Right? So philosophy tends to kind of get divided in two between what's often thought of as theoretical and practical philosophy. But the way to understand it is in terms of the difference between truth and value. Right? Philosophy that's concerned with truth in the abstract, and philosophy that's concerned with value. Right? And here we might say that the two major subdisciplines are metaphysics and logic. Right? Nobody else in the department will agree with how I will define these topics, but it's helpful. So metaphysics is sort of the study of the nature of reality. Like what's real? What actually is the structure of the world when you get down to it? Right? So for instance, a question like, is there a smallest particle, is where physics and metaphysics meet. And you might say questions like, what is time? What is space? What is causation? Right? Is there a first cause? Right? Did the world begin or did it never start? Is it going to end or will it go on eternally? These are metaphysical questions. Right? And we will be looking at some of them in the course. Right? So it's sort of about reality. And sometimes this will be talked about in terms of being. Right? Being, existence, whatever everything is. Right? That everything and nothing. About that. Right? Whereas logic is about thought. Logic is about the nature of thought, what it is. And in particular, it tends to turn into the study of reasoning. How do you reason well? What is a good reason? What is a valid argument? And that's how we move from logic in the classical sense to sort of formal mathematical logic, which is something that you may encounter at some point. Now, on the side of value, this is sometimes called axiology, right? We get epistemology. Ethics and aesthetics. And we have that question, what is the meaning of life? This is where that sits, right? What's important in life? What do we value? What even is value, right? So in epistemology, what we have is the study of knowledge, right? Because knowledge is, in a certain sense, something we do and something we value. When we talk about different scientific theories, right? We will talk about them in terms of being better or worse, more and less elegant, right? We will try and talk about how we should value one and not value another. Right? General relativity is better than Newtonian mechanics, right? That's epistemology, right? It's about knowledge. It can also be about ignorance, but one of my favourite philosophy jokes, the other one, is that epistemologists are ignorant. Talk to an epistemologist, they know nothing, right? Metaphysicians, have no idea what's real. And ethicists are horrible people, like the worst people you could want. So anyway, so ethics is about goodness, right? In some sense, right? Goodness, but in the sense of action. Like, what should we do? What shouldn't we do? What's better to do? What's worse to do? Right? Right? Ethics is about, in some deep sense, living well. Right? How should we live? And then aesthetics is what should we appreciate? Right? You know, what should we appreciate? What are the things that we think are important, even though they've got nothing to do with survival or life or any other thing, right? You know, like, if Tarantino's films were erased, I think the universe would be worse off. But not because anyone would starve. Not because anything ethical had been violated, right? That's aesthetics. Okay. So, appreciation, right? And the other term here is beauty. But that's kind of controversial. Let's just be careful about that. Okay, right. This is a map of philosophy, right? As the art of asking questions. This is what's left over, right? Is everybody okay with that?
There's two other terms that I've heard recently, like ontology and cosmology. Do they fit into the...
Good question. So, ontology and cosmology are in metaphysics. There's actually an old school distinction here between the two halves of metaphysics, between what got called metaphysica specialis and metaphysica generalis. Metaphysica generalis is what people call ontology. And ontology is literally like the logic of being, the study of being, right? That's why I put this word up. But there were also other specialist disciplines like cosmology, psychology, and there's another one that I'm forgetting. Cosmology, psychology, and it'll come to me. But anyway, the idea was there were a bunch of specific questions. Oh, theology. Theology is the other one. Right? That's what we're going to be talking about. So, however, when it comes to the words metaphysics and ontology, you will see them used very inconsistently. Some people will say metaphysics is bad, ontology is good, right? Like ontology is a replacement for metaphysics. And other people will say no, ontology is a part of metaphysics, it's a subdiscipline, right? There's no real good way to cook the cake here. I can tell you about the history, I can tell you about which terms I prefer, but maybe we'll talk about this in seminar. Okay, any other questions before I move on? Any? No? Again, like, I'm really happy for people to put up hands, and if I notice them, which I should, right, to respond, because again, if I say something that no one understands, I'm not doing my job right. So I need you to show me how to do my job better. We will have time for just wide-ranging questions at the end, but as we go, just clarificatory stuff. Okay, right, so that is what philosophy is. According to me, right, who am I? Who cares? But I think this is a good map, because even if you disagree with the way the map is drawn, it at least gives you a way of exploring and understanding things, right? And that's my job, is to give you a map. Right, what comes next then? So we've done a little bit about religion, we've done a little bit about philosophy. What does the "and" mean? Philosophy and religion, right? This is a little bit kind of, a little bit ambiguous. It's a little bit of a Weasley term, right? And can mean a lot of different things, right? So, let me try and break that down, because the way I break that down tells you the structure of how I am going to teach every single lecture, right? So, what can we have? We can have philosophy of religion. Okay, that's one option. We can talk about philosophy in religion. But we can equally talk about philosophy after religion. And in every lecture, my plan is to cover one bit of each of these things. We'll start off by trying to get a grip on the abstract question. Right, so just as I said, like philosophy of physics gets to ask a question like, what is force? Right? Philosophy of religion gets to ask a question like, what is the divine? Right? What is the divine? What do we mean by that? Right? So every lecture I will begin by talking about what the questions we're going to be dealing with are. Right? Philosophy in religion, that's theology. Right? And this is why it is important to do this course, because there's an important sense in which the philosophy and the philosophical tradition that began in ancient Greece and went through Rome, what we call the philosophy of antiquity, right, was kind of pushed into religion. Like it was kind of absorbed into the Christian faith and other faiths, and became theology. It became the tools for thinking about these philosophical questions, right, in relation to religious doctrine, right? So this is the thing. One of the things you might say religion does is actually give an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? Right? They claim to answer that, right? But then when people who are smart come along and kind of go, well, there seems to be this little contradiction in the holy text, right? How are we supposed to make sense of that? If I really want to know the meaning of life, how am I supposed to interpret the text correctly, right? And that's theology. Theology is the sort of importation of these philosophical techniques for asking questions into religion itself. And so that's the history part of what we're going to be doing. Right? So after our questions, we will always do some history of theology, and we will talk about the way in which figures within religions, particularly the Christian ones, but there will be a couple others, answer these questions, or at least articulate them. Right, then philosophy after religion, and again, this is why it's really important to teach this course, because just as philosophy got absorbed into theology, it later exploded out of it again. And this is what tends to be called modern philosophy, like with Descartes. Right? And actually, there's more continuity between Descartes and the thinkers we will be studying than people tend to emphasize. Right? And I'll talk about that when we get to some of these thinkers. But the story that philosophy tends to tell itself is that Descartes kind of broke our relationship to scholastic theology and the doctrine of the church. And from then on, people just started asking questions again. And we got the Enlightenment, and we got 19th century philosophy, and then we got 20th century philosophy, and here we are. Right? So the last thing I will do in each lecture is to talk about a subsequent philosophical development, something that happens later, where it is obvious if you know the theology that this is an evolution of theological ideas. And this also shows you why. So there's a certain kind of atheism, like, hand on my heart, I'm an atheist, right? But for the purpose of this course, I'm an agnostic, right? In my private life, I'm an atheist. But there's a certain kind of atheism that I don't have much time for, which is the sort of Richard Dawkins stripe of atheism, where Richard Dawkins will say something like, oh, well, like the three parts of the Trinity, they're identical and they're distinct, but that makes absolutely no sense. Throw the Bible in the furnace. Throw every text of Christian theology. Throw every bit of work that was done to try and make that idea consistent and the wars that were fought over it away and forget it. Right? No, can't do that. If we want to understand where we are now, we need to understand where we come from. If those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Right? So for any atheists in the room, if you are an atheist, like, I think you have the biggest challenge of everyone in this course, right? I think you need, because atheism is defined as non-theism, right? It's the only negatively defined position that a lot of people identify with. And if you're going to say, I define myself by my rejection of this thing, you need to understand that thing, right? So this is what I'm going to show here, is the importance of understanding theology for the philosophy that comes afterwards. And I'm going to give a bit of an actual example in the second half of the lecture, right? But there will be examples every week. And the other thing is, this means I get to give you a bit of a tasting menu of philosophy. I'll give you everything from Leibniz to Wittgenstein to like weird topics in the philosophy of artificial intelligence, right? Like, I'm gonna give you all sorts of interesting stuff. And that's the optional reading for the course. The compulsory reading that you have to do for every seminar, philosophy in religion, right? Theology. The more weird and wacky and sometimes more interesting stuff, that's optional, right? I recommend you do it, you don't have to, right? But, again, seminars, essays, we have to do this. You can't just skip to this, we have to do this, right? So, I'm going to make you eat your greens, and then you can have your dessert. Okay, right. So, now I need to return to the actual history. This is just all abstract stuff. I need to actually tell you about the history of philosophy and religion, right? And this is the sort of overarching narrative that is going to make you understand what we're doing in the course. I'm not really going to give you dates. I'll give some names, but again, it's less important to have precise facts than to have a feel for the story. And so if there's something that interests you and you think is important, you can go away and research it. Right? That's what I'm doing here. I'm giving you a map. You are here to explore. So, let's get to the history. And again, this is completely Eurocentric, right? And I apologize for that. If you want to do some non-Western philosophy as well as non-Western religion, overjoyed. I have to teach you the Western stuff. So, I need to make sure I've got the actual piece of notes that I need. Yes, okay. I appear to be missing one of my sheets of paper, so, let's roll with it. Okay, so, wait a minute, it might be here. It is. Aha, fantastic. So, I've been talking about philosophy after religion. Well, philosophy is originally after religion, right? Philosophy emerges in Greece as a contrast to Greek religion and Greek tradition. Right? It emerges when people start questioning the stories that religion has given them about the world and about how they should live in it. So, let me use this. This is why PowerPoint slides are easier, and I will probably be using them for the rest of the course. That didn't go well. Never mind. Okay. All right. It's all good. Right. So, the three things we need to know about Greek history, in terms of three words, are mythos, logos, and nomos. Right? Narrative. Stories. Right? Reason, both in the sense of reasoning and in the sense of cause. Right? It also gets translated as word. It's one of these very difficult to define terms. And then nomos is convention. Right? Sometimes also called law, but like law in the sense of a legal code. Like the rules that we have decided to live by, as opposed to those that we think are in some sense imposed upon us by religion, by the Almighty, or by nature. Right? Again, if you're interested in the opposite of that, that's physis, and this is where physics comes from. Right? It's nature. So what we start out with here is the Greek gods. Right? We have gods. Right? And so, for instance, we have like Apollo, Aphrodite, and Zeus. Right? And what do these represent? Now, gods in Greece are there to represent things and to explain things. When you see the oncoming storm on the ocean, that's Poseidon. When you see the lightning in the sky, that's Zeus, right? But they also have another role, and that's more like the encoding of values. So Apollo is the god of truth, the god of messengers, right? Aphrodite is the goddess of beauty, right? And Zeus is the chief of the gods, the father, the ultimate authority, and supposedly the representative of the good, which you might also call the right or the just, right? Now, as anyone who's ever read anything about Zeus knows, the actual stories about him, he doesn't seem to be a very good person, right? So there's this kind of weird clash between the ways in which the gods are used to think about these values and the actual stories about their antics. And this is one of the pressures that pushes the Greeks into creating philosophy. The other thing that happens is we get heroes, right? And this is what gets called, this is where we get epic poetry, like the Iliad, right, and the Odyssey. Right? These are the moments where the Greeks stop simply telling stories about the gods and start telling stories about men. Right? And these men are in themselves still kind of mythical. They're not quite out of the mythic, right? But they seem to correspond to like actual human ideals. So we get say like Achilles, right? And Achilles is bravery. Right? Achilles is the exemplar of the brave. We get Odysseus. Right? Odysseus is the master of cunning. Right? Odysseus is the one mortal man that the gods could not break, because every challenge they threw at him, he met. He bested the gods through cunning, and at the end was rewarded for it. Zeus went, you know what? I'm not even mad, mate. You're like, your class, fantastic. You know, and then we might pick someone like Hippocrates, who's, again, this is the origin of the medical tradition, right? The Hippocratic Oath, right? And Hippocrates, you might say, is something like care, right? Hippocratic Oath, what does it say? First, do no harm. First, do no harm. Only care, only help, right? Okay, so that's the slow emergence of the epic, right, out of the merely religious, right? But what happens when you still keep finding contradictions in the Iliad? Like Achilles and Hector, right, are both these moral paragons who are destined to clash and only one of them can win. Right? We find that very hard to think about in modern society because we tend to think that only one person can be right. But for the Greeks, this was a kind of, this was the source of tragedy. Right? This brutal necessity of two people who are both right being brought low, not because of their own actions. Right? So when you find this sort of stuff, you need to start understanding things. You want to start understanding nature. You want to say, well, maybe we should have a better explanation of why there's storms than just like there's an angry God under the sea. And this is where we get our sort of two different philosophical, pre-Platonic philosophical traditions. And by the way, again, I'm giving you a narrative. A lot of what you will be studying this term, and indeed this year, will be more detailed versions of this. But I need to give it to you so you can understand what comes later. So, in relation to the Logos and, well, in relation to physis, we might say that what we get are the first philosophers, the Ionians. People like Thales. And Thales said, I've got a great explanation for everything. Everything is water. Everything is water. Doesn't matter what it is. That's water, that's water, that's water. Right? If we think of the world this way, it's going to be it's better than thinking we're suffering under the whims of capricious deities. Right? And there's a bunch of other people who do similar things. They'll say everything's air. Right? Or everything is a single piece of cloth tied together out of which individual things are cut. Right? Different ways of trying to come to terms with nature. Right? And again, this is the origins of metaphysics. The origins of physics and metaphysics. Right? Okay. I'm going to finish this story and then we'll have a break. But the other tradition we get is so this is where we tend to just talk about the Presocratics generally, right? But we also get the Sophists, right? Those guys who claimed to be wise. That's what that means. I am a wise person, right? And you get people like Protagoras and Gorgias. Gorgias, best name ever for a philosopher. Not philosopher, a sophist. These people are experts at sowing doubt. They've figured out how to ask questions and how to explain things and make arguments in ways that can undermine anything. You give them anything and they show you how to critique it, right? This is the art of rhetoric. And you know what? They started teaching that to the youth of Athens, and particularly the youth of the upper class who could pay for it, right? So the sophists went around giving weapons to the oligarchy in Athens to control the democracy, right? Right? Whatever your interests are, I can show you how you explain it to people and convince them. Right? It's a political thing. So Socrates is the answer to the sophists, right? Socrates turns up and says, you know what, I'm not wise. You guys are wise, that's fine. And then rips them to pieces. Right? Rips each and every one of them to pieces. And this is what Plato's dialogues are kind of a recreation of. Right? Socrates was a political figure, and he was a political figure because he was tackling this idea of convention and law. The sophists showed you how to question convention in ways that were to your advantage. You know, like, well, you know, here's a contemporary example. Well, I didn't know she was 18, but like, you know, what even is adulthood, right? You know, quite relevant, right? That's the sort of thing that the sophists taught you how to do, right? And Socrates opposed this by rejecting the idea that all there is convention, right? Socrates really is about introducing ethics in the sense of living well. He wants to say there are truths about how we should live and how we should live well, which are not, right, mere convention. So to give you a few more other words, like there are various words for knowledge in Greek. So where we get epistemology from is episteme, right, which is kind of theoretical knowledge, and there's also a techne, which is kind of practical knowledge or craft, right? And what Socrates does is to use examples of things like craft to reject the challenges of something. So, crucially, what Socrates will say is that thought itself is a craft. Thought is something that can be done well or badly, independently of what convention is. Like if you contradict yourself, that's not something that we have agreed is bad. It's just something that is bad, right? And that's the kind of root of Socratic philosophy. On the other hand, going back to the physicist side of things, right? What we end up getting coming out of Thales eventually, is Parmenides and Heraclitus. Again, you're going to be studying all this in depth. But Heraclitus and Parmenides give us like a sort of split between what you might call being and becoming. Right, stasis and change. Like one of the things that the Greeks were sort of obsessed with in trying to understand is like, say the seasons, right? The seasons change, but they also stay the same. Like they're always the same seasons. We don't suddenly get like a fifth and sixth season, right? So this tension between stasis and dynamism was a key thing to think through. And Parmenides and Heraclitus come down on exactly opposite ends of the spectrum. Parmenides says, everything is one, that's all the same, right? That's the reality of things. And things just appear to be distinct, right? Like there's truth, which is everything's one, right, and unchanging. And then there's appearance, which is, or seeming, which is, we've got different things and they change and stuff, but you know. Whereas Heraclitus says, all there is fire, right? All there is constant change and flux, right? And yeah, if you want to understand Plato, and Plato is the person we need to understand in order to understand early Christianity, right? And Plato is the person who combines Socrates and these. He combines sort of the thought about physis, which will become metaphysics, with thought about ethics and value, right? Plato is sort of the first real systematic philosopher. And when we get back from our break, I will explain that, and I will explain early Christianity. Okay? 15 minutes? Go. Okay, is everybody back here? I think we've got everybody back basically. So, one more person. Actually, the room doesn't look quite as horrifically packed as it was. Maybe that's just me. Anyway, okay, I'm going to start again. A couple points of order. One, I didn't realise nobody does seminars in the first week. This is the first course I have taught, right? So when I say it's important to get feedback, it's very important to me. But yeah, so I planned out seminars for this week. But you know, if you don't want to turn up to them, that's fine. You have to turn up to the ones from now on. If you don't want to turn up this week, okay. But I would encourage you to, because the seminars this afternoon and in the rest of the week are going to be very freeform, right? We don't have a lot of important stuff to work through. It's more kind of this general stuff, trying to kind of just figure out the questions we're interested in and we want to talk about. So I'll say a bit more about that at the end of the lecture, but, you know, if you feel like turning up to seminars this week, please do. Two more points of order. I didn't have time to print out any of the course outlines. It is available on Blackboard. You can print it out yourself, but I will try and print some out and bring them to seminars. So there you go. And one final issue, which I should have mentioned at the beginning and I forgot to, and it's very important, which is accessibility. If anyone has any issue with the way in which any aspect of the course is done that just doesn't fit them, right? If you are dyslexic, if you have anxiety problems, if anything, right? You can contact me or Zoe, and we will do our best to make the course fit you rather than you having to fit the course, right? This is very important. So, any issues, please get in touch. The other thing is, I know a lot of people have asked about recordings of the lecture. This lecture should be being recorded right now, and it should be automatically available on Blackboard. This will be the case for every lecture. And what this means is, if you can't come to a lecture, fair enough, but it also means you will be expected to watch it. Like, you can't give the excuse of, oh, I couldn't turn up, so I didn't. Well, if you don't watch the lecture, that's on you, not on me, right? Okay, back to philosophy itself, right? Plato. So, what I've said is that, where did I put the, here we are. What I've said thus far is that Plato kind of unites these two things. Plato sort of, if you remember our set of questions we were doing before, Plato kind of unites the questions about sort of truth, like metaphysics and logic, that the other Presocratics were interested in, with the sort of questions about value and ethics and living well that Socrates is interested in, right? And he thereby becomes this kind of systematic thinker. And you're going to learn a lot about Plato on the course, and I don't want to tread on anybody else's toes. In fact, I'm going to be doing some of the seminars on the Plato course, but I do need to tell you enough for Christianity to make sense. And crucially, one of the things you need to know is that Christianity didn't come full formed. Like, it didn't just come into being and it was just the way it is now and then. Actually, there were centuries and centuries of changes and developments and ways in which it could have gone differently. And I want you to kind of have some appreciation for that. And again, the only way to do that is to see the importance of philosophy's influence on Christianity. Because in a certain sense, Christianity was the first philosophical religion. Right? In the sense of being directly influenced by Greek philosophy. So, the thing that Plato does on the side of metaphysics, on the side of truth, right, is he gets a whole bunch of different distinctions that the pre-Socratic philosophers were interested in and unites them under one master distinction. Right? So he has this distinction between the intelligible and the sensible. Right? And in Plato, these are kind of like, almost like two separate worlds, but more really like two halves of the same world. Right? And the halves that are accessible to intellect alone, to thought alone, and the half that is only accessible to the senses. Right? So one important additional influence on Plato was Pythagoras, who's a mathematical philosopher who accepted mathematics. And Plato sees mathematics as the kind of exemplar of this pure thought that doesn't require anything from the senses.
Do you see it as the language of being?
In an important sense, yes. I mean, again, there's debates to be had around that, but like Plato was definitely on that side of things, right? But again, the big question was the rest of the universe, like the the arena of pure thought in which we just talk about things like triangles and prime numbers and these mathematical objects, right? How does that connect to the sensible world of, and this is the stupid examples that philosophers always use, tables, chairs, lectern theatres, because we're always in lecture theatres and seminar rooms. We always pick the easy things. But more generally, the stuff that I was saying before, like the storm, right? The storm, the lightning, right? How do we understand these things that are sensible as being related to the intelligible, right? And the way in which the things that Plato kind of aligns here are being and becoming, right? That split between Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? The sensible world is the world of becoming and books. The intelligible world is the world of stasis and atemporality, right? Pi never changes. Pi is always 3.1, right? Reality and appearance, that distinction that Parmenides had, right? Right? That gets related to this, right? Like the really real stuff is the stuff you can just think about in itself. Right? The idea of a circle is more real than any actual circle that you see, right? Unity and multiplicity, right? Well, okay, there's one idea of a circle, and there are many, many circles in nature, right? Better example might be, say, the Fibonacci sequence, right? The Fibonacci sequence is one Fibonacci sequence. You find it everywhere, in cauliflowers, in a variety of different things.
Is that a hexagon?
Huh?
The hexagon?
Yeah, it can be. It's anything which has a certain kind of spiraling. So the Greeks were obsessed by stuff like this, like the golden ratio. Like the golden ratio is an ideal, but you can see it in things in the world. That's kind of unity multiplicity. Things that are sensible are many. Things that are intelligible and have unity, right? And this has been very important. The other distinction here is perfection and imperfection, right? Right? The one singular idea of the circle is perfect, but no circle you find in nature is perfect. Right? This is the difference between the intelligible and the sensible. Now, what's important to understand is that in Christian theology, what this becomes is the distinction between spirit and matter. The spiritual and the material. The soul and the body. Right? And this is directly taken out of Plato, because Plato doesn't just have a theory. He doesn't just have a theory of ideas, right? These ideal unities that we can think. He also has a theory of the soul or the intellect, right? And this is the side of his thought that is definitely Socratic, right? So just to kind of be clear, I'm kind of going to box this off, but the most important, the cardinal ideas for Plato are truth, beauty, and goodness, or the good, right? If you've been listening and paying attention, that's Apollo, Aphrodite, and Zeus. But with all of those weird narrative things stripped away. Right? Plato's very self-consciously replacing these religious ideas. Right? And crucially, Plato thinks these are all, in a certain sense, the same thing. These are different aspects of the same thing. And even more importantly, he thinks that we think about the soul in terms of how we relate to these ideas. Because what these give us are sort of three different tasks, right? So like, the soul is about thinking, right? Thinking is governed by truth. Thinking is the attitude appropriate to truth. Right? Love and loving, right, is the attitude appropriate to beauty. Right? Things that are beautiful are things that should be loved. Right? Lorenzo will teach you about this in Plato, this is the Plato module. And then goodness is about acting. What you do. Goodness is the thing, well, acting, and acting in a moral or a virtuous way is the thing that is appropriate to goodness. Now, here's the sort of key thing about Plato that binds all of this together. Again, you'll study this in the Republic. He thinks that all of these things are in some sense the same because you can see that thinking and loving are both things you do. They're both kinds of action that are governed by certain demands and certain standards of excellence, certain values, right? So in this sense, the good or the right or the just, is the thing that encompasses the rest. It's the thing that encompasses beauty as a way of thinking about perfection. Right? The beautiful things in the world are the things that are most like the ideals, the ideas, right? And it's also the thing that encompasses truth, because thinking is a craft. Thinking is something you can do well or badly. Thinking is governed by the good, right? The good binds together the intelligible and its relationship to the sensible, right? And the way Plato interprets this, quite weirdly, is to say that actually the soul is a different kind of thing. The soul is not the same kind of thing as tables and chairs and lightning and ish. Like, that's a bit of a development after Plato, because the word energia is actually very important. I'll say something about that. The Plato thinks that when we die, our souls are freed from our bodies and pass through the realm of the intelligible, and there they learn and experience the ideas. So that in our lives, when Socrates comes up to you and says, what is justice, what is truth, what is number, right? What he's getting you to do is just remember. Remember your experience as an ideal soul, stripped from a body, right? And that way of thinking about the soul as on the side of the intelligible, as separate from the sensible, has an incredible influence upon Christianity. Okay. That's all I'm going to tell you about Plato. That's my quick summary of Plato, right? And I need to get to other things, and I need to talk to you about Neoplatonism. Right? So, how do we do this? What I'm going to tell you is a very, very potted story about the history of the origin of Christianity, right? So the thing you need to understand is that Christianity emerged in Judea, right? And Judea was a Roman province, right? The Jewish people were under the political control of Rome, but they were equally under the cultural influence of Greece. Is that okay? No, okay. So, like, Greek as a language was the common tongue of the Mediterranean, right? You learned Greek so you could read literature and read philosophy, right? And people in Judea were actually quite familiar with philosophy. Like, if you were wealthy enough and you had the time and the training, right, you could go and read Plato and Aristotle and get something out of it, right? One of the most interesting and important sort of Neoplatonic thinkers, Philo, was Jewish, right? So there's a sort of twin influence upon Christianity there. it's important to know is that Christianity was always political. Right? There were a lot of different political movements in Judea at this time, like the Zealots, who were completely opposed to Roman rule in a kind of radical, militant way. Whereas the Christian approach to Roman rule was pacifist. Right? Was about peace, not about war. Right? Now, again, I'm being agnostic here. Jesus might be the Son of God, or he might not be. Right? But these are the historical facts. After Jesus was crucified, right, his followers became a kind of splinter sect of Judaism, right, like a new kind of micro form of Judaism. And they then spread out and recruited people who were never Jews in the first place. Right? The first century of Christianity's life, what we call the apostolic age, right, was about this kind of proselytizing, spreading the word, right, to other people. So this was the job of the apostles, who were Jesus' original followers, but then also of St. Paul, right? In term 2, Lorenzo was going to talk to you about St. Paul. Right? Paul never knew Jesus, but he became the single biggest marketer of Christianity in the Mediterranean, let me put it that way. He was the biggest influence on the spread of Christianity. And again, this is when the books of the Bible are written in a variety of different ways, and they're only kind of collected there. One other important fact here is this is why the Holy Spirit is important in Christianity, because the Holy Spirit is, Jesus is the Word of God made flesh. Right? Jesus is the Word of God made flesh. Jesus is the Logos. Right? And you can see exactly why philosophy is going to be quite important to understand that, right? But the Holy Spirit is the way we know Jesus. So, like, the apostles got to meet him in person. But if you were, in Syria, right, in the 1st century AD, right, you never got to meet Jesus. You might get to meet someone who met him, right? And the idea of communion, of joining the communion of the church, becoming part of the covenant, right, was gaining access to the Holy Spirit, which is your means of knowledge of the divine. This is how you personally access the divine. Now, the other key, so basically what I've said is spreading the word, right? And the word is Jesus, right? Spreading the word of God, Jesus, right? That's one of the key things that defines early Christianity. The other thing is salvation, right? And it's important to understand that early Christianity was kind of like a millenarian sect. What we mean by that, millenarian, is so you get these different groups throughout history that emerge around what they take to be significant points, like say around 1,000 years since the coming of Christ, right? Where they go, now everything, like the shit is going to hit the fan, right? Now we're going to get the messianic return, right? The original Christians thought Jesus was coming back straight away. Like, the idea that Jesus was going to return was an imminent thing. It might happen in their lifetimes. And the longer Christianity went on, the more it had to get away from that idea. The more it had to change what it thought salvation was. So salvation was basically understood in 2 ways. One is the forgiveness of sin. Forgiveness of sin. And the other, okay, I'm running out of time. And the other is the resurrection of the dead. And you've got to understand, in fact, let's call that the promise of eternal life. So this is what Jesus represents. He represents the promise that we can come back from the dead, there will be eternal life. Right? And understanding what this means was incredibly important for early Christianity. This is more important than the ontological argument. If you've ever studied that at A level, this is so much more important for Christianity than that. The other way to think about this is to say that Christianity as a political movement was about emancipation, it's about freedom, right? And what we have here are freedom from guilt. Salvation, Jesus will free you from guilt, right? And on the other hand, Jesus will free you from suffering. Like, your life is awful, Jesus will free you from that. And this is why Christianity spread amongst the poor, the oppressed, the weak, right? The meek shall inherit the earth. Right? This was the promise of Christianity. Okay. Now, the political things that shaped Christianity were, again, the fact that it was the religion of the oppressed, and it was constantly being repressed. This is why we have the idea of martyrdom. Like, Christians were being thrown to lions. Right? This was happening. Right? But the other thing was that it was related, had to distinguish itself from its sort of closest competition. So it had to distinguish itself from Roman paganism, which is basically just Greek religion with the serial numbers piled off. And it also had to distinguish itself from Judaism. Right? And later on, it had to distinguish itself from competing versions of Christianity. Right? There were a variety of other things turned up. In particular, what gets called Gnosticism, which is very influenced by some of the Platonic things I was saying before, and a lot of the early church fathers had to kind of argue against this like splinter group of more radical Christians, right?
How are they more radical?
So, we've got this split between the intelligent and the sensible, right? This is the soul and the body. Right? For the Christians, this is all created by God. Right? God created both sides. Why would he do anything else? Right? For the Gnostics, no. God didn't create the world of matter. God didn't imprison us in flesh. He didn't imprison us in a world where we would experience suffering and guilt and all this stuff. Like, no, that's another thing called the demiurge. It's like a false God that creates the universe within which we are trapped. And Gnosticism is, we have to escape. We have to escape into the intelligence, right? And this is why Sophia is an important word in Gnosticism. And there are a variety of different kinds of this.
I was just going to ask, you know that was like one extreme, like,
Yeah.
you know, one being one associated with the other. Is there one that's like a meet in the middle?
There's a whole variety of things. Go away, look at Wikipedia, search Gnosticism, you will find some fascinating things. You'll find some books of the Bible that didn't end up in the final version, like the Gospel of James.
So the demiurge was Plato's god, wasn't it, who created the material world? So did the Gnostics believe that there was two gods, a Christian god and this other god?
Yeah, it's similar to like Zoroastrianism and what became Manichaeism, which is actually post-Christian. But there's two figures. There's a good one and a bad one. And what the church had to do was to say no. Even if we accept there's a devil, the devil is always subordinated to God. It's all in the plan. Yeah, I'm running out of time because I'm bad at bringing myself down. So I'm going to have to rush through. But you can see what's going on. The other thing that Christianity had to compete with was philosophy itself. Right? It was a kind of philosophical religion, but it had to compete with philosophy. Right? So there's a kind of push and pull in the relationship between Christianity and philosophy. Crucially, the early church fathers, we sort of think the study of them is called patristics. Right? They were kind of split between the Greek and the Latin fathers, depending on which language they used. And the most important of the Greek ones is a guy called Origen, which is quite a good name for someone at the beginning, he had a very, very Platonic view of things, where he thought at the beginning of the world we are all just souls, to a pure thought, right? And then some of us fall. Some of us fall into the material world. The ones who are left, who stay close to God, are angels. We are the rejected angels. We are the angels who couldn't keep ourselves aloft, right? Which became a kind of heretical position later. But at the beginning, it was all open to determination. It was all open to argument. On the other hand, you have the Latin church father, Tertullian, who was a complete and utter materialist. He was like, no, we've got to, like, matter is important, like, the body is important. He even thought the soul was material. He's like, no, all of this Platonist stuff is nonsense. And he would literally be just sort of say, look, all this philosophy is just crap, right? Forget about it. We need to do Christianity properly and not import all this Greek stuff. One really cool little thing I want to mention, and it will get me into the final thing I want to talk about, is there was also an interesting little church father called Athenagoras, who saw this question of the resurrection of the dead and eternal life. Again, that's controversial. What that means, no one really knows, right? And so the question of whether you are you when you're raised from the dead is a difficult one. How do we know that the thing that gets resurrected is the same thing as you? Does it have to just have a soul? Does it have to have a body? What even is a soul? What even is a body? Right? The early Christian church fathers were some of the first people to think about personal identity. And the way, and they also came up with some of the first, most entertaining arguments. So, like, because Christians were being thrown to lions, Athenagoras had to argue that, well, human flesh can't really be digested. Like, yeah, the lions are eating you, but it's all coming out the other end because God can then get it all together and turn it back into you at the end of time, right? Or whenever the resurrection happens, right? Like, if lions could digest human flesh, that's going to cause a problem, right? Again, not everybody thought that, but that's the kind of debates that were being had, and they're debates which stay with us. If you have some intuitions about what it is for you to continue to exist, they come in many ways from the history of these debates. Okay, so, final stuff. Plotinus, right? Plotinus is the sort of founder of Neoplatonism, right? Plotinus kind of modifies Plato, right? And the important thing to understand is Plotinus was actually taught Plato by the same person who taught Origin. Like, they were contemporaries, right? And Plotinus came up with this idea which he called the one, right? So, you know, over here we have these distinctions between unity and multiplicity. Plotinus took that way further. He said, actually, this idea of the good is the only unity. It's pure, it's simple, you can't pull it apart, right? And you can't even think about it as being. It's just so radically different from everything else, right? But what you get beneath the one is what he called emanations. So after that, you get like logos, you get the intelligible, you get all the individual ideas like circles and prime numbers and whatever. And beneath that, you get psyche, suke, right? Soul, right? And this is where energia comes in, because this starts as a world soul and then gets split up into all of the individual ones. We all have a part of suke, as do animals, right? Because it's the energy that animates, right? And this comes all the way down, and the idea is you go from spirit to matter, and matter is the thing at the bottom which is just without any of the good stuff. It's the leftover, it's like the absence of unity, right? Now, this isn't really how things work in Plato. In Plato, there are multiple ideas. Yeah, the idea of the good is the most important one, but it's not like it's the only one, right? Whereas for Plotinus, the distinction between unity and multiplicity is made so extreme that it is what determines this split in the world. The reading for this week's seminar is a bit of Plotinus, and it's about the concept of beauty, the idea of perfection and imperfection, and how he sees that in relation to this picture he's got. And the reason it's important to understand this is because this is Augustine. Augustine takes Plotinus and uses it to build the bedrock of Christianity. And Augustine is the first real theologian we're going to study. And the way in which the course is organised over these two halves of the term is we start off with the Platonic Christian theologians coming out of Augustine. And then we're going to come to, in the second term, the people who were influenced by Aristotle. And I will talk to you about how Aristotle changes this picture, and then how this ultimately leads to Thomas Aquinas, who is the official. He's the official story of the Catholic Church. Thomism, his doctrine, is the thing that shapes Catholicism, right? So, you know, Plato, Plotinus, to Augustine, right? And we're going to get Aristotle and Aquinas and other people later. Right, I have a tiny amount of time left, particularly as I'm supposed to let you go 5 minutes before. So let's see how much more I can fit in. Here's the bit of philosophy after religion that I wanted to talk about. I set this as reading, it's optional. There's this thing on the internet, you know, because the internet has a lot of things on it, called Roko's Basilisk. And it's a thought experiment. Roko's Basilisk is a potential future super powerful artificial intelligence, right? And what Roko's Basilisk does is it finds anybody in history who knew about this thought experiment and did not then go out and spend all of their time making sure that Roko's Basilisk exists, right? And resurrects them as a computational simulation and then tortures them for all eternity, right? Right? This is the resurrection of the dead, but the resurrection of the dead as eternal damnation, right? And as soon as anyone tells you about Roko's Basilisk, like I am doing now, you are doomed to eternal damnation unless you go out and spend all of your money on AI research, right? This is a fantastically absurd thought experiment, but it is obviously theological, right? And one way it's theological is that it's a version of Pascal's wager. Pascal will say, like, look, the risk of eternal damnation isn't worth not acting as if you believe in God, right? Just on the off chance that there is eternal damnation, you should act as if you believe in God, right? It's got the same structure as that. But actually, what's more interesting is the resurrection bit, right? So, I'm going to get people to raise their hands. Who thinks that a computational simulation of themselves at some future point in history would be them? Like, if this happens to you, is it going to be you or is it going to be a different thing? Those who think yes, put up your hands. No? On the fence? Okay. Those who think no, put up your hands. Most of you, right? Those intuitions that you have about the fact that this is not going to be you, those intuitions are shaped by the history of Christian philosophy. And the thing I was telling you about lions not being able to eat people, right? That's what you get when you try and understand the soul and its relationship to the body. Is your soul just a piece of information that can be recreated? Or is it something more substantive? Is it something metaphysical? Right? That's an example of philosophy after theology. Philosophy after religion. Right? And that's the sort of stuff that we're going to be talking about more in the course. So, I have 5 minutes left. So, I have a few final announcements. I wish I had more time for questions, but if you want to ask them, there are seminars. Come to them this week, and we can talk about them. I want to say something about how to take a course, because you guys are turning up, no one's told you what it is to do university, what's expected of you. I understand this, and what I want to do is to teach you how to take a course as you take a course. I have to. What university is about is you teaching yourselves. I'm here to guide you, but what it is not about is me giving you a series of facts that you write down in bullet points and then you regurgitate in an essay. A-level treats education like it's that. If you've done A-level and A-level philosophy, you'll be very tempted to think, oh well, I can just regurgitate the notes that I took at A-level. You can't, right? It's really, really obvious when people do this in essays. Really obvious, right? And you know what? If you do it, you're kind of cheating yourself, right? Like, I don't really care about what grade you get in your essay, or even if you end up dropping out of university at the end of this course, right? What I care is that you get something out of it personally, because this is the only time in your lives where you get to ask these questions about anything. And this is why philosophy is important and interesting. It's about what you personally get out of it. Getting you to write essays and marking them and giving you stuff, that's feedback, that's modulation. That's us trying to make sure that you're getting as much out of this as you can, you know. And there will be at least one person in here who thinks, nah, not going to do that. I'm just here to win. I'm just here to play the game and get the mark at the end. And if that's you, fine, right? Fine, right? That's your thing, right? But I want to encourage you to try and see this as something more than that game of getting the good mark. Right? And this is why seminars are important, because in seminars you get a chance to sit down and talk about the things that you think are important. If you have strong feelings, or if you really don't know, this is the place where you get to try and work them out. And for some people, they don't like seminars. Some people feel it hard to talk and say things out loud, to ask questions or to express their own opinions. If that's you, that's fine. Again, I'm more interested in the fact that you yourselves are sitting down and having conversations. If someone never comes to any of my seminars, but they have a reading group where they do sit down and read the material and talk with other people, that's fine. That's the important thing, that you are sitting down and talking about this stuff. And being wrong, because you will be wrong a lot. But that's what learning is, right? If you're afraid to be wrong, if you're afraid to commit, to put any effort in, you're not going to get anything out. And I want you to get as much out of this course as possible. Because you are paying for it, right? I think this is what you are paying for, not the essay mark at the end of the course. Right. That's my little thing done. Zoe? Anything?
Not much else to say. Yeah, in seminars, don't take it as competition. Never be like scared to share your ideas or think they're going to steal them and put them in their own essay. It's all about talking to people. And the same as what Pete said, no one ever learns anything from being right. So I'll be happy to talk about in seminars what I don't know. So I'd expect you to do the same back.
Oh, one other final point. So here's just some recommendations. Everybody learns differently. And one of the things you'll be doing here is learning how to learn and figuring out what's best for you. Right? But here's a recommendation of mine. The lectures are going to be recorded. Right? If you need to take notes, take notes. Right? If that's part of your process whereby that's how something goes into your brain and your memory, fine. If all you're doing is keeping track so that you don't have to remember, if it's an alternative to remembering, don't do it. Listen. Go to seminars, talk. Don't write things down unless it actually helps you, right? If at the end of the term you have a big stack of notes and you couldn't write an essay and you're like, I'm not really sure what any of this means, that would be the worst thing, right? You can always go back and rewatch the lecture, right? Similarly, one final point about seminars, not this week, but in future weeks, I highly recommend printing out the essay, reading it, putting notes on it, maybe writing questions, bring those to seminars, and that's how we will organise seminars, right? If you need to use electronic stuff, that's fine. If you've got accessibility issues, that's fine. But don't simply use a laptop because you think it's easy because it will distract you. So let's be together and let's talk. Right. Thank you. You've been a great audience.